Wind was a thief in Silas Blackwood's land, stealing the warmth from the sun and the moisture from the soil. It was a constant mournful sound that echoed the hollowness in his own chest, a hollowness that had been his only companion for 5 long years. He was riding the fence line, his gaze scanning the cracked earth not for stray cattle, but out of a habit that was older than his grief. His horse, a sturdy buckskin named Dust, plodded along. As accustomed to the silence as Silas was, that's when he saw it. A flicker of movement near the cottonwood that grew, defiant, by the mostly dry creek bed. It wasn't an animal. Animals moved with purpose or fear. This was the slow, pained slump of a body, giving up. Silas reined Dust to a halt, his hand instinctively resting on the stock of the Winchester in his scabbard. Trouble came in many forms out here, and he'd learned long ago that caution was a cheaper currency than regret. He dismounted, his boots sinking into the parched dirt. He moved slow, keeping the meager cover of the scrub brush between him and the figure. As he got closer, he saw it was a woman, an Apache woman, by her deerskin dress and the dark fall of her hair. She was curled on her side, her back to him, her body so still he thought for a moment the wind had been playing tricks on him. But then a tremor ran through her, a shudder of profound weakness. He stepped out from the brush. "Ma'am?" he called out, his voice a rough, unused thing. The woman flinched, trying to push herself up. The effort was a failure. Her head turned and Silas felt the air go out of his lungs. Her face was a mask of suffering, her cheekbones sharp as flint, her dark eyes sunken and wide with a fear that was older than him. Her lips were cracked and pale. She was starving, not hungry, not peckish, starving to death, right here on the edge of his land. He saw her eyes dart to the rifle on his saddle, and a flicker of something, resignation maybe, passed over her face. She thought he was here to finish the job that the land had started. Silas held up his empty hands, moving slowly, as if approaching a spooked foal. "I'm not gonna hurt you," he said, his voice softer now. "I've got water." He unhooked his canteen from his saddle horn and walked toward her. She watched every step, her body tensed. He stopped a few feet away, unstoppered the canteen, and set it on the ground between them. Then he backed away, giving her space. For a long moment, she just stared at the canteen, as if it were a trap. Then, with a groan that seemed to tear from the very depths of her soul, she crawled forward. Her hands shook so badly she could barely lift the heavy tin. She brought it to her lips and drank, not with greed, but with the desperation of a soul being pulled back from a cliff's edge. Water spilled down her chin, darkening the front of her dress. When she was done, she slumped back, her breathing ragged. Silas knew this was only the first step. Water wouldn't fill a belly that had been empty for days, maybe weeks. He had jerky in his saddlebags, but that would be too much for her right now. She needed broth, something warm and gentle. She needed shelter. He looked back toward his ranch, a lonely silhouette against the vast, indifferent sky. Bringing her there was a risk. Folks in the nearby town of Redemption didn't take kindly to the Apache. They were ghosts, reminders of a war that had left scars on both sides. Bringing her in could mean trouble he hadn't invited and didn't want. But then he looked back at her, a human being fading into dust at his feet. His wife Sarah would have never hesitated. Her memory was a sharp, clean pain in his heart. He'd made his choice before he even knew he was making it. Honor wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. He walked back to his horse. "I'm taking you back to my cabin," he said, not to her, but to the wind. "You can rest there, get some food." She watched him, her dark eyes unreadable. He wasn't sure if she even understood his words. He moved toward her, slowly, and knelt. "Can you stand?" She tried, but her legs gave way. Without a word, Silas gently scooped her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of bone and leather. She stiffened at his touch, a wild thing, unused to being held. But she was too weak to fight. He carried her to his horse, lifted her into the saddle, and then mounted behind her, holding her steady. Her head fell back against his chest, and he felt the fragile, ragged rhythm of her breathing. He turned Dust toward home, the weight of the starving woman a strange and heavy burden against his empty heart. The cabin was more of a fortress against loneliness than a home. It was sturdy, built of thick pine logs Silas had felled and stripped himself. Inside it was spare and clean. A stone hearth, a rough-hewn table with one chair, and a bed in the corner. A second, smaller room held his supplies. It was a place built for one man's survival, not for comfort. He carried the woman inside and laid her gently on his bed. She sank into the straw-ticking mattress, her eyes closing with exhaustion. Her breathing was shallow, a faint whisper in the quiet of the room. For a moment, Silas just stood there, feeling like a trespasser in his own home. The presence of another person, especially a woman, was a ghost of a life he'd long since buried. Shaking off the feeling, he moved to the hearth. He stoked the embers from the morning's fire and put a pot of water on to boil. He didn't have much in the way of delicate food. He found a piece of salt pork and cut off a sliver, dropping it into the water along with a handful of dried beans and a crumbled biscuit. It wasn't much, but it would make a thin, warm broth. While the water heated, he looked back at her. Her face, in the dim light of the cabin, was all sharp angles and shadows. She was younger than he first thought, maybe 20, maybe less. Life in this land aged everyone too fast. Her deerskin dress was worn thin, and her moccasins were falling apart. He saw a long, ugly scar on her forearm, pale against her skin. This was a woman who had seen her share of hardship, and then some. When the broth was ready, he ladled some into a tin cup. He sat on the edge of the bed and gently propped her head up with his arm. "Here," he said softly. "You need to eat, just a little." Her eyes fluttered open. They were filled with a wary intelligence. She looked at the cup, then at him. He held it to her lips, and after a moment's hesitation, she sipped. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each swallow seemed to require all of her strength. He fed her half the cup before she turned her head away, her body signaling it was enough. He laid her back down, and she was asleep almost instantly, a deep, healing sleep. Silas stood up and walked to the other side of the room. He ate his own meal of jerky and hardtack standing up, his eyes never leaving the figure on his bed. The silence of the cabin was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with the soft sound of another person's breathing, and it was a sound that both comforted and unsettled him. He spent the night in the single wooden chair, his rifle across his lap, not because he feared her, but because her presence had reminded him that the world was a dangerous place. He was protecting her, and in doing so, he was protecting a part of himself he thought had died with Sarah and little Jacob, the part that knew how to care for someone other than himself. He must have drifted off because he was startled awake by a sound. The sun was just beginning to cast a pale light through the single window. The woman was awake. She was sitting up in bed, her blanket pulled up to her chin, watching him with those same unreadable eyes. There was a little more life in them now. The haze of starvation was beginning to recede. "Good morning," he said, his voice raspy from sleep. She didn't respond. She just watched. He stood up, stretched the kinks from his back, and moved to the hearth to restart the fire. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements sure and practiced. He was aware of her gaze on him the entire time. It wasn't hostile, but it was intensely observant, as if she were memorizing every detail. He made more broth, a little thicker this time. He took it to her, and she accepted it, drinking from the cup on her own. When she was finished, she handed it back to him, her fingers brushing his. Her touch was light as a feather, but it sent a jolt through him. "My name is Silas," he said, wanting to fill the silence. "Silas Blackwood." She looked at him, her lips parting as if to speak, but no sound came out. She simply gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Then she swung her legs over the side of the bed. She was unsteady, but she was determined. She stood using the bedpost for support. He started to move toward her to help, but she held up a hand, a clear sign for him to stay back. She took a single, wobbly step and then another. Her pride, it seemed, was the one thing that hadn't starved. For 3 days, a quiet routine settled over the cabin. Silas would wake early, make a simple meal of broth or a thin porridge, and leave it for her on the table. He gave her his bed, taking the chair or the floor for himself. He afforded her a privacy that was hard to come by in a one-room cabin, busying himself outside with chores from sunup to sundown, only coming in when the chill of the evening drove him indoors. He never pressed her for her name or her story. He knew trauma. He knew it was a wound that didn't like to be prodded. He simply provided food, water, and the silent promise of safety. He learned her rhythms. She was quiet as a shadow, moving through the small space with a grace that belied the ordeal she had endured. She would watch him mend a harness or clean his rifle, her eyes following his hands, her expression a careful blank. On the 4th day, Silas returned from checking his well to find her standing by the open cabin door, staring out at the land. She had washed her hair in the basin he used, and it hung down her back, a sheet of shining black silk. She wore her deerskin dress, which she now saw she had painstakingly mended with a needle and thread from his own small sewing kit. There was a strength in her posture that hadn't been there before. The fragility was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet resilience. "You're looking better," he said, stopping a few feet away. She turned to him. For the first time, she spoke. Her voice was low and melodic, though touched with a hint of disuse. "You are a good man." The words, simple and direct, struck him with surprising force. No one had called him a good man in a long time. He felt a flush of heat rise to his neck. "Just doing what anyone ought to," he mumbled, looking down at his boots. "No," she said, her gaze steady. "Not anyone. My people were scattered by soldiers. My husband was killed. I ran. I have seen what anyone does." There was a world of pain in that short statement. Silas didn't know what to say. "I'm sorry," felt like an insult, a hollow token for a loss so profound, so he just nodded, acknowledging her truth. "Amnita," she said, finally giving him her name. "Silas," he repeated, as if they were meeting for the first time. A silence fell between them, but it was different from the ones before. It was a shared silence, not an empty one. "I cannot stay," Nita said, her voice firm. "I have brought you trouble." "You've brought no trouble to my door," he countered. "And you're not strong enough to travel yet. Stay. At least until your strength is fully returned." She considered his words, her dark eyes searching his face. She seemed to be looking for a hidden motive, a debt she would be expected to pay. She found none. Silas's face was open, his eyes clear. He was a man who said what he meant. It was a rare quality. "For a few more days," she agreed. "Then I must go." Those few days turned into a week. Nita's strength returned in full. She began to help with the chores, not because he asked, but because it was her nature. She moved with a quiet efficiency, sweeping the floor with a handmade broom, tending the small fire, and even preparing their meals from his meager supplies. She had a knowledge of the land he couldn't match, pointing out edible roots he'd overlooked, and showing him how to make a soothing tea from juniper needles. The cabin began to feel less like a shelter and more like a home. The evenings were no longer silent. She would speak of her people's stories, of the coyote and the eagle, her voice a soft murmur against the crackle of the fire. He in turn found himself talking about his ranch, the cattle, the struggle with the seasons. He never spoke of Sarah or Jacob. That part of him was a locked room, and he had long ago lost the key. One evening he was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, and she was sewing a patch on his shirt. The domesticity of the scene was so powerful it ached. It was a life he thought he'd never know again. "You are lonely," she stated, not as a question but as a fact. Silas stopped his work, his hands stilling on the cool metal of the rifle. He looked at her. "I'm used to it. It is not a thing a man should get used to," she replied softly. He didn't have an answer for that. He just went back to cleaning his rifle, but her words stayed with him, echoing in the quiet places of his heart. He was used to it, but that didn't mean he liked it. Her presence had been like a single candle lit in a dark room, and he was beginning to dread the moment she would take that light with her. The morning Nita chose to leave was crisp and clear, the sky a brilliant, cloudless blue. Silas woke in his chair to find the cabin empty. His bed was neatly made, the blanket folded with the precision he could never manage. A small, carefully wrapped parcel of leftover jerky and a full water skin sat on the table. His heart dropped. He knew this day would come, but he hadn't expected it to be so sudden, so silent. He bolted outside. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills, painting the landscape in hues of orange and gold. He scanned the horizon in every direction, and then he saw her, a small figure walking steadily east, not looking back. He didn't even think. He saddled Dust with a speed born of urgency and galloped after her. He caught up to her in a few minutes, reining the horse to a stop in her path. She paused, her face calm, as if she had been expecting him. "Where are you going?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "I told you I must go," she said. Her eyes held a deep sadness, but also an unshakable resolve. "You have saved my life. I will not repay you by putting you in danger." "What danger?" he demanded. "There's no danger here." "There is always danger for a woman like me," she said, a bitter truth in her words. "And for any man who helps her. The people in the town, they will not understand. They will see you as a traitor to your own kind. They will take your land, or worse, I will not be the cause of your ruin." He knew she was right. He knew the whispers that would start, the cold shoulders he would receive at the general store, the inevitable visit from the sheriff. He knew all of it, and in that moment he realized he didn't care. "Let me worry about the town," he said, dismounting. He stood before her. "This is a hard land to survive alone, Nita. Where will you go? What will you do?" "I will survive," she said. "I always have." "You almost didn't," he reminded her, his voice gentle but firm. "Stay, please." The plea hung in the air between them. It was more than an offer of shelter. It was a crack in the wall he had built around himself, a confession of a need he hadn't admitted even to himself. He needed her to stay. She looked at him, and for the first time he saw a conflict in her eyes. A part of her wanted to accept, to rest in this small pocket of safety he offered. But the other part, the part that had been forged in loss and survival, screamed at her to keep moving, to trust no one. "I cannot," she whispered, and the finality in her voice was like a door slamming shut. She reached out and for a brief, startling moment laid her hand on his forehead. Her touch was warm. "Do not forget me, Silas Blackwood." And then she was gone. She walked around him and continued east, her back straight, her pace unwavering. He stood there, watching her grow smaller and smaller, until she was just a speck against the vastness of the prairie. He had the sudden, absurd urge to get back on his horse and force her to return, but he couldn't. It had to be her choice. He remained there long after she had disappeared from view, the dust settling around his boots. The sun climbed higher, its warmth a mockery of the cold that was seeping back into his bones. The cabin, which had briefly felt like a home, was now just a lonely shelter again. He had made his choice, a decision that would bring danger to his door. As he closes that door, we hope you're enjoying this story of courage. If you are, taking a moment to like the video helps us bring more tales like this to you. Now, with the latch thrown, the real challenge began. A year passed. The seasons turned with a slow, grinding indifference. Silas fell back into his old life, but it no longer fit him properly. The silence of the cabin was heavier now, filled with the memory of Nita's soft voice. He found himself looking to the east, scanning the horizon for a figure that never appeared. The brief light she had brought into his life had only served to show him how deep the darkness really was. He kept to himself more than ever, his trips into redemption becoming rare and brief. He'd heard the whispers. A couple of riders from a neighboring ranch had spotted him with an Apache woman. The story had festered in the town's imagination, growing more sordid with each telling. He was met with suspicious glares and a wide berth at the general store. He didn't care. Let them talk. It was late spring, the time of year when the land grudgingly offered up new life. He was repairing a corral fence when he felt it, the prickling sensation of being watched. He straightened up slowly, his hand drifting toward the colt at his hip. He scanned the low hills surrounding his ranch. At first he saw nothing, then a flicker of movement, just as before. Standing on the ridge where he'd first seen her was Nita, but she was not alone. His heart hammered against his ribs. He dropped his tools and began to walk, then run toward the ridge. As he got closer, he saw that a small child was holding her hand. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, with the same dark hair and serious eyes as her mother. He slowed to a walk as he approached, not wanting to frighten them. Nita stood her ground, her expression as calm and unreadable as ever. She looked healthier than he had ever seen her, her cheeks full, her dress clean and well kept. The little girl, however, clung to her mother's leg, peering at him with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Nita," he breathed, the name feeling strange and wonderful on his tongue after so long. "Silas Blackwood," she replied, her voice the same low melody he remembered. She gently pushed the child forward. "This is my daughter. Her name is Little Dove." Silas knelt down so he was on the child's level. "Hello, Little Dove," he said softly. The girl hid her face in her mother's dress. Silas smiled, a real, genuine smile that felt rusty from disuse. He looked back up at Nita. I thought I'd never see you again. I had to return," she said. "A debt of honor must be paid. You saved my life. My life is the only thing of value I have, but it belongs to my daughter now. to see that she is Silas was confused. A debt? There's no debt between us. Nita's expression grew solemn. In the ways of my people, when a life is saved, a life is owed. I have nothing to give you. No horses, no blankets. I have only my daughter. She took a deep breath, her words coming out with a heavy weight. I have returned to offer her to you. When she is a woman, she will be your wife. She will tend your home and give you sons. The debt will be paid. She will be safe. Silas stared at her, stunned into silence. He looked from Nita's impossibly serious face to the small, frightened child hiding behind her. A wife? This child? The idea was abhorrent, a violation of everything he believed in. He felt a surge of anger, not at her but at the brutal world that had pushed her to this desperate, unthinkable offer. He stood up, shaking his head. No, Nita, no. I can't accept that. That's not our way, and it's not right. Fear flashed in Nita's eyes. Then you refuse the offer? You shame my house? We have nowhere else to go. The lands of my people are gone. The soldiers, the settlements, there is no place for us. Her composure finally cracked, and he saw the raw desperation beneath. She had walked all this way, pinning her daughter's entire future on this one terrible hope. I'm not refusing you, Silas said quickly, his voice urgent. I'm refusing the offer. There's a difference. You and Little Dove, you need a place to stay, a home. You can stay here, both of you. Not as payment for a debt, not as a future wife, as family. I'll protect you. I give you my word. Nita stared at him, her mind struggling to comprehend his meaning. He was offering sanctuary without a price. He was offering kindness without obligation. It was a concept so foreign to her experience that she didn't know how to accept it. You would do this? She whispered. For nothing in return? It's not for nothing, Silas said, his gaze softening as he looked at Little Dove, who was now peeking out at him again. A man needs a reason to get up in the morning, a reason to keep fighting. Maybe you're it. He extended a hand, not to her but to the little girl. Come on, he said gently. I bet you're hungry. I've got a warm fire, and I think there's some molasses candy left in the jar. Little Dove looked up at her mother, who watched Silas with eyes full of a dawning, fragile hope. Nita gave a small nod. Tentatively, the little girl let go of her mother's dress and took a single step forward, placing her tiny hand in Silas's rough, calloused one. The touch was electric. In that moment, Silas Blackwood, the lonely rancher, ceased to be a man living in the past. He was a man with a future to protect. A new rhythm took hold of the ranch, this one with 3 heartbeats instead of 1. Little Dove's presence transformed the place. Her childish laughter, a sound Silas hadn't heard in years, was a balm to the cabin's oppressive silence. She was a whirlwind of curiosity, chasing butterflies, asking endless questions about the cattle, and leaving a trail of small, precious messes in her wake. Silas found himself changing. The hard lines around his eyes softened. He carved a small wooden horse for the girl, spending hours by the firelight, carefully shaping the toy with his knife. When he presented it to her, her gasp of delight was a greater reward than any cattle sale he'd ever made. Nita watched it all with a quiet, observant stillness. She had accepted his offer of sanctuary, but a part of her remained wary, waiting for the other shoe to drop. She ran the small household with a silent efficiency that astonished him. The cabin was cleaner, the meals were better, and his mended clothes were folded in a neat pile each morning. She was creating a home around them, piece by piece. Slowly, the wall between them began to crumble. They talked more in the evenings, sharing stories. She told him of her childhood, of the vibrant life her people led before it was all taken away. He, in turn, finally unlocked the door to his past. He told her about Sarah, about her warm laugh and the way she'd loved the wildflowers that grew in the spring. He even spoke of Jacob, his son, a bright, happy boy who had been taken by a fever along with his mother. It was the first time he had spoken their names aloud to another soul in 5 years, and the act of sharing the grief seemed to lessen its crushing weight. Nita listened without judgment, her empathy a quiet, comforting presence. You carry them in your heart, she said, her hand briefly covering his. They are not gone, they are a part of your strength. But their small island of peace was not to last. The world outside had a long memory. The threat came not in the form of outlaws or soldiers, but in a man with a clipboard and a cold smile. His name was Elias Barlow, an agent from the Territorial Land Office. He was a man who fed on the weakness of others, a vulture in a dusty suit. Barlow rode up to the ranch one afternoon, his horse a sleek, expensive bay that stood in stark contrast to Silas's working stock. Nita saw him first and quickly ushered Little Dove inside the cabin, her face a mask of anxiety. "Silas Blackwood?" Barlow called out, dismounting with an air of unearned authority. "That's me," Silas said, walking over, wiping his hands on his trousers. He didn't like the look of this man. Barlow's eyes were small and greedy, and they were already taking in the size of the ranch, calculating its worth. Elias Barlow, Territorial Land Office, just doing a routine survey of property deeds and usage, he said, though there was nothing routine about his sharp, accusatory tone. His eyes flickered toward the cabin door, where Little Dove's face had appeared for a second before disappearing. "Heard some interesting rumors about you in town, Blackwood. About your company." "My company's my business," Silas said, his voice level and cold. Barlow smirked. "Not when it violates territorial decency statutes, and not when it involves squatters on land that might have an unclear title. Your deed, registered 10 years ago, was for a single homesteader. It makes no provision for natives." He said the word like it was a contagion. "She's not a squatter," Silas said, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "She and her daughter are under my protection. They live here. This is their home. Is it now?" Barlow's eyes gleamed. "That's a very charitable arrangement. So charitable it might make a man wonder. It also complicates your claim. This land is valuable, Blackwood. The railroad is eyeing a route through this valley. A man with a clear title and a proper family could stand to make a fortune. A man with a messy situation, well, his claim could get lost in the paperwork. Reassigned to someone more suitable. The threat was clear. Barlow wasn't just a bureaucrat. He was a predator. He wanted the land, and he saw Nita and Little Dove as the lever to pry Silas off it. "You stay away from them," Silas growled, taking a step forward. Barlow held up his hands in mock surrender, a greasy smile on his face. "Just a friendly warning, Mr. Blackwood. Get your house in order. The territory likes things to be neat and tidy. I'll be back." He mounted his horse and rode off, leaving a cloud of dust and a palpable sense of dread in his wake. Silas stood there for a long time, watching him go. The external threat had arrived. It didn't carry a gun, but a pen, and in this new West, the pen could be far more dangerous. The shadow of Barlow's visit lingered over the ranch. A tension settled in the cabin, thick and suffocating. Little Dove sensed it, her laughter becoming less frequent, her questions replaced by a watchful silence. She stayed closer to her mother, her small hand often seeking Nita's for reassurance. Nita grew withdrawn. She performed her chores with the same diligence, but her eyes were constantly scanning the horizon, searching for the dust cloud that would signal Barlow's return. She blamed herself. "I told you I would bring you trouble," she said to Silas one evening, her voice barely a whisper. "This man, he wants your land. He will use me to take it." "This isn't your fault, Nita," Silas insisted, his voice fierce. "Men like Barlow don't need a reason, they just need an excuse. If it wasn't you, it'd be something else. The well running dry, a disputed fence line. His kind always finds a way." "You should send us away," she said, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Before he returns, you can tell him we are gone. Your claim will be safe." "No," Silas said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He moved to stand in front of her, waiting until she looked up to meet his eyes. "I gave you my word. This is your home. I protect my own. We are not running." The conviction in his voice was absolute, and it stirred something deep within Nita. For years, her life had been about running, about survival. The idea of standing one's ground, of fighting for a place, was a foreign and frightening concept. But looking into Silas's determined face, she felt a flicker of hope. Silas knew he couldn't fight Barlow with his fists or his gun. This was a different kind of battle, one fought with paper and laws he didn't understand. The next day, he rode into redemption. He tied dust in front of the saloon, ignoring the hostile stares from the men gathered on the boardwalk, and went straight to the sheriff's office. Sheriff Brody was an old, tired man whose loyalty was more to an easy life than to the law. He listened to Silas's story with a weary expression, his fingers drumming on his desk. "Barlow?" Brody sighed, leaning back in his chair. "He's a territorial agent, Silas. Official business. My hands are tied. He's got the authority to review any claim he deems irregular. "It's not irregular, it's my land," Silas said, trying to keep the frustration from his voice. "And he threatened me. He's using Nita as a pretext." "An Apache woman," Brody said, his eyes narrowing. "You can't deny that complicates things. People are unsettled. It's not right, maybe, but it's the way it is. My advice, don't make waves. Barlow has friends in high places. You fight him, you'll lose more than just your ranch." Silas left the sheriff's office with a cold knot in his stomach. The law was not on his side. He was alone in this. As he walked toward the general store to get his supplies, he saw Barlow coming out, laughing with a couple of the town's more influential ranchers. Barlow saw Silas and his smile widened into a predatory grin. He gave Silas a slow, deliberate nod before turning back to his companions. The message was clear. This town is mine. Silas felt a familiar rage building inside him, the helpless anger of a good man being backed into a corner. He was a rancher, a man of the earth. He knew cattle and seasons, not laws and loopholes. How could he fight a snake like Barlow? He returned to the ranch that evening with a heavy heart. He found Nita and Little Dove in the corral watching the sunset paint the sky in fiery colors. Little Dove ran to him, wrapping her arms around his legs. He lifted her up, holding her tight. "The sheriff will not help," Nita stated, reading the answer in his face. "No," Silas admitted. "We're on our own." He expected to see fear in her eyes or despair. Instead, he saw a quiet resolve that mirrored his own. She walked to his side, placing a hand on his arm and looking out at the land that had become their home. "Then we will face him together," she said. It was not a question, but a declaration, a promise. In that moment, they were no longer a man, a woman, and a child. They were a family, bracing for the coming storm. The waiting was a unique form of torture. Every distant rider, every dust devil on the horizon sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through the cabin. Silas took to wearing his Colt at all times, a heavy, cold reminder of the coming confrontation. He and Nita worked in a tense silence, the unspoken threat hanging between them like a shroud. It was during this time that Silas began to see the true depth of Nita's strength. She was not passive in her fear. She began to prepare. She taught Little Dove how to be quiet, how to hide in the small root cellar beneath the cabin floor at a moment's notice. She showed Silas the places in the rocks behind the cabin where a person could watch the main trail, unseen. Her knowledge of survival, born from a life of hardship, was now their greatest asset. One afternoon, while Silas was reshoeing dust, Nita approached him, a determined look on her face. "You need to teach me," she said. "Teach you what?" "How to use the rifle," she said, nodding toward the Winchester that leaned against the cabin wall. "If Barlow comes with men, you cannot be the only one who can fight." Silas hesitated. The thought of putting a gun in her hands, of her having to use it, filled him with a cold dread. He wanted to protect her, to keep her far from the violence he knew was coming. But he looked at her face, at the steel in her eyes, and knew that to deny her would be an insult. She was not a damsel to be hidden away. She was a warrior in her own right. He nodded. "All right." He took her to a small, secluded arroyo a mile from the cabin. He set up some tin cans on a rock and showed her how to hold the heavy rifle, how to brace it against her shoulder, how to sight down the barrel. It was awkward in her small frame, but she was a quick study. Her hands were steady, her focus absolute. Her first shot went wide, the kick of the rifle startling her, but she didn't complain. She simply took a deep breath, reset her stance, and tried again. The second shot sent a can spinning. A small grim smile touched her lips. They spent the rest of the afternoon practicing until she could reliably hit the targets. As they walked back to the cabin, the setting sun casting long shadows behind them, a new understanding passed between them. It went beyond gratitude and protection. It was the deep, unshakable bond of two people preparing to defend their home, their family, together. The shared purpose had forged a connection that words could not capture. That evening, as Little Dove slept soundly in a small cot Silas had built for her, he and Nita sat at the table in the quiet glow of the lantern. The tension of the past weeks had given way to a kind of calm resolve. "I never asked you," Silas said softly, "about Little Dove's father." Nita was silent for a moment, her gaze distant. "He was a great hunter," she said, her voice filled with a quiet reverence. "A brave man. He died fighting the soldiers so that we could run. He saved us." "I'm sorry," Silas said, the words feeling inadequate as always. "Do not be," she said, turning her eyes to him. His spirit is with the stars now. He would be glad that little Dove is safe. He would be grateful to you." Her gaze was intense, and it held something he hadn't seen before, a warmth, a tenderness that went beyond respect. He felt an irresistible pull, a longing that had been dormant for so long it felt like a new and startling sensation. He saw her not just as a survivor to be protected, but as a woman, strong, beautiful, and courageous. His heart, which he had thought to be a dead and barren thing, beat with a new and powerful rhythm. He didn't plan it, he didn't think about it. He simply reached across the small table and took her hand. Her fingers curled around his, a perfect fit. They sat there for a long time in the quiet of the night, their hands clasped together. No more words were needed. They had found each other in the midst of a storm, and they would face whatever came next, united. The storm broke 2 days later. Silas was on the porch sharpening an axe blade when he saw the dust cloud. It was bigger this time. 2 riders. He recognized Barlow's sleek bay immediately. The man beside him was Sheriff Brody. "Nita," Silas called out, his voice low and urgent. "Inside. Get little Dove to the cellar, now." Nita moved without a word, her face pale but her movements swift. Silas watched the riders approach, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Brody's presence was a bad sign. It meant Barlow had made this official. He wasn't just a vulture anymore. He had the law on his side. They reined in their horses a few yards from the cabin. Sheriff Brody looked uncomfortable, his eyes avoiding Silas's. Barlow, on the other hand, was beaming, a triumphant smirk plastered on his face. "Blackwood," Brody began, clearing his throat. "Mr. Barlow here has filed a formal complaint. An injunction from the territorial judge. You're accused of harboring a fugitive from the reservation and illegally occupying this claim with unauthorized persons." "Fugitive?" Silas spat. "She's no fugitive. Her people were scattered. She's a survivor." "The law doesn't see it that way," Barlow cut in, his voice dripping with false sympathy. "The injunction gives us the authority to remove the squatter and her child. And I'm afraid to place this property in territorial custody until your claim can be re-evaluated." "You're not setting foot in my house," Silas said, his hand hovering over the butt of his Colt. "Don't be a fool, Silas," Brody warned, his hand moving to his own gun. "This is a legal order. You draw that weapon and I'll have to arrest you or worse." "He's right, Blackwood," Barlow said, dismounting. He held a rolled-up piece of paper. "The injunction. It's all legal and tidy. Now be a good man and have the woman come out. We'll make this as painless as possible." Barlow started walking toward the cabin. Something inside Silas snapped. The years of grief, the loneliness, the quiet desperation, and the fierce protective love he'd developed for Nita and little Dove, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. "I said," Silas growled, drawing his Colt with a speed that made Brody flinch, "stay away from my house." Barlow froze, his smirk vanishing, replaced by a flicker of fear. "Brody, do your job," he squeaked. "Silas, put the gun down," Brody pleaded, drawing his own weapon but not aiming it. He didn't want this to end in bloodshed. Suddenly, the cabin door creaked open. Nita stood there, the Winchester rifle in her hands. She didn't point it at them, she held it across her chest, a silent statement of intent. Her face was set like stone. Barlow's eyes went wide. "You see, Brody? Armed and hostile. I told you." The standoff was absolute, a tense, silent triangle of guns and wills. The wind whistled through the corral, the only sound in a world that had shrunk to this single explosive moment. Silas knew that one wrong move, one twitch of a finger, would unleash hell on his small piece of land. He locked eyes with Brody. He saw not a villain, but a weak man caught in a situation he couldn't control. "Sheriff," Silas said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through him, "you know this is wrong. You know what he is. You really going to let him tear a family apart for a piece of land?" Brody's face was a mask of conflict. His duty fought with his conscience. But before he could answer, Barlow, emboldened by the sheriff's presence, took another foolish step forward. "Your family?" he sneered. "You and that's not a family. It's an abomination, and I'm going to wipe it clean." That was his mistake. As he spoke, a small face peeked out from behind Nita's legs. Little Dove. Her eyes were wide with terror. The sight of that terrified child galvanized Silas. This was no longer about land or laws. It was about a father protecting his child. "Get off my land, Barlow," Silas said, his voice dropping to a deadly calm. "Now." or I swear to God they'll be burying you where you stand." The raw, murderous conviction in his voice finally cut through Brody's hesitation and Barlow's arrogance. This was not a threat. It was a promise. The world seemed to hold its breath. The sun beat down, the wind died, and the only movement was the twitch of Brody's finger on the trigger of his revolver. He was caught in the middle, his gaze flickering between Silas's unyielding stance and Barlow's sputtering indignation. "Are you going to let him threaten a territorial official, Sheriff?" Barlow shrieked, his voice cracking with a mixture of fear and rage. "Do your duty." But Silas wasn't looking at Barlow anymore. His focus was entirely on Sheriff Brody. He saw the sweat on the old man's brow, the tremor in his hand. Brody had known Silas for years. He knew him as a quiet, solitary man who had buried his wife and son and asked nothing of the world but to be left alone. He also knew him as a man of his word. "Silas," Brody said, his voice strained, "there's a judge's name on this paper. It ain't a request. And there's a woman and child in that house," Silas countered, his voice never rising, never losing its lethal calm. "A judge's name doesn't make a wrong thing right. You know that, Henry." Using the sheriff's first name was a calculated risk. It was a reminder of the men they were, not the roles they were playing. It was an appeal to the man who had once offered condolences at Sarah's grave, not the badge wearer taking orders from a snake like Barlow. From the doorway, Nita raised the Winchester. She didn't aim it, but held it at a low ready, the message clear. She was not a passive victim in this drama. She was the second line of defense. Brody's eyes darted to her, then to little Dove, who was now clinging to her mother's dress, her small face a portrait of fear. Something in the old sheriff's hardened expression seemed to crack. Maybe he was thinking of his own grandchildren. Maybe he was just tired of being a pawn for powerful, cruel men. "This has gone far enough," Brody declared, but his words were not directed at Silas. He turned in his saddle to face Barlow. "We're leaving." Barlow's jaw dropped. "What? Were you insane? He drew on us. We have the injunction. The injunction is to remove a squatter, not to preside over a bloodbath." Brody snapped, his authority finally returning. "Blackwood ain't gonna back down, and I'm not losing a deputy or my own hide, so you can steal his ranch. This is over. For today." "This isn't over," Barlow screeched, his face purple with fury. "I'll go to the marshal. I'll bring back the cavalry. This land will be mine." He wheeled his horse around and galloped away, his threats trailing behind him on the wind. Sheriff Brody lingered for a moment. He looked at Silas, then at Nita. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, a gesture of grudging respect. Then he too turned his horse and rode away, leaving Silas and his family standing in the sudden, deafening silence. Silas slowly, deliberately lowered his colt and engaged the safety. He took a deep, shuddering breath, the adrenaline beginning to ebb, leaving him feeling shaky and drained. Nita lowered the Winchester, her shoulders slumping in relief. She knelt and swept little Dove into her arms, burying her face in the child's hair. Silas walked to them, his legs feeling like lead. He knelt beside them, pulling them both into an embrace. He could feel Nita trembling. Little Dove was sobbing quietly. He held them tight, the three of them a small, defiant island in a hostile world. They had won. They had faced the threat, and they had not broken. They had made their stand. Together. "It's all right," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "It's over. We're safe." Nita pulled back to look at him, her dark eyes shining with unshed tears. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. Her expression was one of profound, overwhelming love and gratitude. She reached up and cupped his jaw, her thumb stroking his rough cheek. And in the golden light of the afternoon sun, surrounded by the dust and the danger, she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of deep, soulful connection. A kiss that sealed their bond. A promise of a shared future, earned in a crucible of fear and courage. The victory felt fragile, like a thin sheet of ice over a deep lake. They knew Barlow was not a man to accept defeat. He would be back, and next time, he would likely not be accompanied by a man with a conscience. That night, the mood in the cabin was subdued. The relief of the afternoon had been replaced by the cold reality of their situation. Silas was cleaning his guns at the table, his movements methodical. Nita was patching a tear in Little Dove's dress, though her eyes kept strained to the window, to the darkness outside. "He will return," she said, stating the fact that weighed on both of them. "I know," Silas replied without looking up. He'll go to the territorial capital. It'll take him a week or more to get back with the U.S. Marshal, maybe longer. We have some time. Time for what? She asked. To run? Silas finally stopped his work and looked at her. No, I'm done running. This is our home. It's time to fight. He paused, gathering his thoughts. But not with guns. Not this time. He's using the law against us, so we have to use it back. He explained his plan. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only one he had. The town of Redemption was named for a reason. It was founded by people looking for a second chance. People who, at their core, understood the difference between right and wrong, even if they sometimes forgot. Barlow had their ears now, but he didn't have their hearts. The deed to this land, Silas said. It was co-signed by my neighbor, old man Abernathy. He passed on a few years back, but his son Thomas runs the ranch now. And Thomas Abernathy is an honest man, and more importantly, he's the chairman of the town council. Will he help you? Nita asked, a sliver of hope in her voice. I don't know, Silas admitted. We haven't spoken in years, but his father was a good man. He believed in giving a man a fair shake. Maybe Thomas does too. Early the next morning, Silas rode out, not toward town, but toward the Abernathy ranch. He found Thomas Abernathy mending a fence, the very picture of his stern, hard-working father. Thomas looked up, surprised to see Silas. Blackwood, he said, his tone neutral. Abernathy, Silas replied, dismounting. I need your help. Silas laid out the whole story, from the day he found Nita starving to Barlow's threats and the standoff with the sheriff. He didn't embellish or plead. He just stated the facts man to man. Thomas listened intently, his weathered face unreadable. When Silas was done, a long silence hung between them. I've heard the talk in town, Thomas said finally, his eyes fixed on the horizon. Didn't pay it much mind. Figured it wasn't my business. It is now, Silas said. Barlow's trying to steal my land. He's using a good woman and her child to do it. Your father's name is on my deed, Thomas. He vouched for my character. I'm asking you to do the same. Thomas looked at Silas, his gaze searching. My father always said you could judge a man not by his friends but by his enemies. And having a man like Elias Barlow for an enemy, that speaks well of you. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. Barlow's been sniffing around a lot of properties, mine included, talking about the railroad, making promises. A lot of folks are taken in by him, but I never trusted him. Too slick. He drove a fence post into the ground with a powerful swing of his mallet. All right, Silas, I'll help you. There's a town council meeting in 2 days. You be there. You bring your family, and you tell them exactly what you told me. I'll stand with you. 2 days later, Silas, Nita, and Little Dove rode into Redemption. Nita was dressed in her finest deerskin, her hair neatly braided. Little Dove, holding Silas's hand, looked around with wide, nervous eyes. As they walked toward the town hall, the whispers and stares followed them like a plague. The town hall was packed. It seemed the whole town had turned out to see the spectacle. Barlow was there, sitting in the front row with a smug look on his face, a stack of papers in his lap. He looked confident, like a man who had already won. Thomas Abernathy called the meeting to order. We're here to discuss a complaint brought by Mr. Barlow against one of our own, Silas Blackwood. Barlow stood and gave a slick, polished speech about the law, about the integrity of land claims and the danger of vagrants and hostiles. He painted Silas as a sympathizer and a lawbreaker. When he was done, the room was silent and the townspeople looking at Silas with suspicion. Then Thomas Abernathy looked at Silas. Silas, you got something to say? Silas stood up. He was not an eloquent man. He was a rancher. He held Little Dove's hand tightly in his own. I'm not much for speeches, he began, his voice quiet but clear, carrying to every corner of the room. So I'll just tell you the truth. He told them everything. He spoke of his loneliness after his family died. He told them how he'd found Nita, half dead from starvation. He told them of her quiet dignity, her strength. And then he looked directly at the crowd, at the faces of the people he had known for years. This man, he said, pointing a trembling finger at Barlow, he talks about laws, but he doesn't care about the law. He cares about greed. He wants my land, and he's willing to destroy a woman and a child to get it. He wants to tear apart my family. He paused, his voice thick with emotion. I look at Nita and Little Dove, and I see a second chance, a chance to have a home again, a family. This ain't about a land claim. It's about what's right. He looked down at Little Dove. This is my daughter, he said, his voice ringing with a conviction that came from the very bottom of his soul. This is my wife. This is my family. And I'll be damned if I let him or anyone take them from me. A stunned silence fell over the town hall. Silas's words, simple, honest, and filled with a raw power, had struck a chord deeper than Barlow's legalistic threats. He hadn't just defended his actions. He had laid his heart bare for the entire town to see. Barlow leaped to his feet, his face red with fury. This is absurd. He's admitting it. He's cohabiting with a savage. It's illegal, immoral, and an affront to this community. But the tide had turned. The people in the room were no longer looking at Silas with suspicion. They were looking at Barlow with a growing distaste. They were ranchers, farmers, and shopkeepers. They understood hardship. They understood family, and they recognized a greedy man when they saw one. Thomas Abernathy stood up, his tall frame commanding attention. I've known Silas Blackwood my whole life, and my father knew him before me. He's a good man, a quiet man, but a man of his word. And what I see here is a man protecting his family. He turned to the crowd. This ain't a legal matter for the territorial capital. This is a community matter. Do we let an outsider like Barlow come in here and tell us how to live? Do we let him tear apart a family based on prejudice and greed? A murmur went through the crowd. A rancher in the back stood up. Silas is right. Barlow tried to pressure me into selling my south pasture last month. Said he had investors. Smelled rotten then, smells rotten now. The blacksmith's wife, a stern woman who rarely spoke, stood as well. That Apache woman, she said, pointing at Nita. She came into my husband's shop last week with Mr. Blackwood. She carried herself with more dignity than some of the ladies in this very room, and that little girl, she's just a child. One by one, the people of Redemption began to speak out, not just in support of Silas, but against the predatory nature of Barlow. The land agent's smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a panicked, cornered look. He had misjudged them. He had seen them as simple, greedy fools he could manipulate. He hadn't counted on their sense of community, their inherent decency. Sheriff Brody, who had been standing silently in the back, finally stepped forward. He walked up to Barlow and spoke in a low but firm voice. Mr. Barlow, I think your business in Redemption is concluded. I'd advise you to be on the next morning stage. It wasn't a suggestion. Defeated and humiliated, Barlow gathered his papers and stormed out of the town hall, the hostile stares of the entire town following him out the door. With the threat gone, the tension in the room broke. People started to crowd around Silas, clapping him on the back, offering words of support. Thomas Abernathy shook his hand firmly. My father would have been proud, Silas. But Silas only had eyes for Nita. She was looking at him, her face a beautiful, breathtaking canvas of love, relief, and pride. He pushed through the crowd and went to her. He took her hand, then cupped Little Dove's small face. It's over, he said softly. We're home. They rode back to the ranch under a sky full of stars. The silence in the cabin that night was not empty or tense, but filled with a deep, abiding peace. Little Dove slept soundly in her cot, the wooden horse held tightly in her arms. Silas and Nita sat on the porch, looking out at the land that was truly, finally, theirs. You called me your wife, Nita said quietly. Silas turned to her. In the moonlight, her eyes seemed to hold all the mysteries of the night sky. I felt right, he said, his voice husky. It felt true. My offer of my daughter, she began. Your offer was born of desperation, he interrupted gently. I want you to be my wife, Nita. Not because of a debt, not because of a custom, but because I love you. Because you and Little Dove, you brought my heart back to life. Tears welled in Nita's eyes, but they were tears of joy. She leaned her head on his shoulder. I love you, Silas Blackwood. You are a good man. You are my home. He wrapped his arm around her, holding her close. The wind whispered through the cottonwoods, but it was no longer a mournful sound. It was a song of peace, of new beginnings. The lonely rancher was no longer lonely. He had found his redemption, not in a town, but in the family he had built. A family born of courage, honor, and a love that was strong enough to make the desert bloom. You've just witnessed a story of quiet strength and redemption. If this tale resonated with you, subscribe to our channel for more stories from the American West. Let us know your favorite moment in the comments below. Thank you for watching.